My channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This right here is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 834, and it is titled The Younger Generation and Its Attitude Toward Life, written by Ralph Oppenheimer. Now this is part 2, so we start off with chapter 2, and also wanted to mention, the generation that this book is referring to, I think it's copyrighted in 1927, I believe, is, yes, 1927, is dead. They were born 1900 to 1910. So, this generation is gone, that it's referring to as the younger generation. Alrighty, and these are problems that the younger generation faced in the 1920s, not modern. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 2, The New Environment. When the present younger generation came into the world, some strange changes were taking place. Changes so strange that we have called this epoch the New Age. To begin with, the advanced era of machines was dawning. The automobile, the airplane, the telephone, etc., had just been invented. Man was constantly seeking new mechanical devices to perform his labor. Now, as I have mentioned, many children did not share the luxuries and comforts of machinery, but, nevertheless, they were all brought up in the spirit of the machine age, the spirit of efficiency and speed. In a word, materialism. However, to my mind, this was only one big factor in a movement which hinged on something far deeper. And I mean by this, the death of Christianity. Right here is where some of my readers will take violent issue. However, I must ask them to bear with me, to remember that I am merely a member of the younger generation trying to describe the situation as I see it. To continue, when we came into the world, Christianity was on its last legs. Hence was where the materialistic spirit of the machine age played its biggest part. Such inventions as the airplane, the telephone, the huge skyscrapers certainly disputed the existence of God and made the miracles described in the Bible seem insignificant. Science and art had dealt the death blow. The theory of evolution and the new psychology were triumphing. The influence of Nietzsche, who himself was still unrecognized, this being only a few years after his death, was spreading over the whole civilized world. His work proved beyond doubt that man was clinging to a dead thing, decaying and rotten, and that he must seek something new and greater. But was this new thing to be some form of religious worship? No. He was to seek it through himself, through his own development, his own power. Now, all the old traditions of civilization had been based on Christianity, which laid down a specific set of morals dictating what was right and what was wrong. Its death meant that these traditions would have to be smashed and new ones set up. The older generation naturally refused to accept this fact. Planted in Puritanism, they had grown up in it. In spite of the new materialistic environment, they still clung frantically to the dead religion. In fact, to save it, they tried to apply it to business, in the form of service to the people, muckraking, etc. Recently, they've become even more desperate than this. We find Bruce Barton writing that Jesus was the original Babbitt, a real red-blooded he-man and a peach of an advertiser. What is the world coming to? And on this sad amalgam of big business and Christianity, such cities as Los Angeles, though not all of them are so apparently named, grew up with real estate and revivalism booming together. What could furnish more conclusive proof that Christianity is dead than its apparent strength in America? Now, some people have this sad conception that it is more powerful than ever. Is nothing but a mirage, or a last frenzied crusade on the part of the old faithful adherents. Of course, the impulse behind this new crusade was an unconscious one. Most people did not even realize what was happening, but, belonging to the old, they fought instinctively against the new. The Golden Rule and the 10 Commandments must be upheld at all costs, must remain the code of the race. Consequently, they embraced anything which ballyhooed these one-sided, tattered principles, whether it was fundamentalism, revivalism, or Christian Science. However, we must not neglect to mention that brave minority of artists and thinkers among the older generation, the valiant little group who were ahead of the race, who knew that Christianity was dead and sought to stamp it out entirely, who, in short, raised their voices in revolt even before the younger generation was heard of. Of them, it can be said that they paved the way for the big movement. This brings us back to our main thesis once more. It was shortly after Christianity had breathed its last faint breath that the new generation came into the world, the first generation to be brought up in an entirely different environment. And since new goes to new, from the very start, the younger generation associated itself with a new spirit. They could not accept the old traditions because, unlike their parents, they had never known any other environment. In other words, they had no tangible evidence that Christianity was alive. They had never seen the time when it was vital enough to command real belief. Try as they would, the parents could not enlighten them. Every argument of the older people was refuted by the materialism they saw around them, and it was also this materialism that had led them to demand concrete facts before they could be convinced. Show them an airplane flying in the clouds and they would accept it as true, but tell them that there is a God who is everywhere, punishing evil and rewarding good, and they would doubtless reply, "How could there be such a God? Prove it to me." I once heard a minister trying to convince a modern flapper that her rouged lips, bobbed hair, short skirts, etc. were sinful. "Why are they sinful?" demanded the girl eagerly. The younger generation will readily take up any argument. "Because you are immodest," said the minister. "Immodest?" she retorted. "Where do you suppose modesty would get you in these days? The boys wouldn't look at you. You've got to be attractive if you want to catch a husband. And what's the crime? It's more of a crime to be an old maid, isn't it? But such pretty vanity is evil. It is against the law of God." "How do I know that?" "The Bible tells us so." "God didn't write the Bible," said the girl with a sophisticated air. "A bunch of men wrote it. And if there is a God, how do men know what His law is?" "God revealed Himself unto them," replied the minister reverently, "and spoke unto them." "Well then, why doesn't He speak to me if I'm wrong?" A mischievous gleam came to her eyes. "Listen, you say He does not like immodesty. Don't you?" "Exactly," said the minister, falling right into her trap. "Well, listen," triumphantly. "When He put Adam and Eve on earth, did He put any clothes on them?" "No. All the picture shows them nude. And for all I know," she added guilelessly, "God Himself goes around with nothing on." The minister could not answer this. Speech had deserted him. The attitude of this girl is typical of the younger generation, and once more I must add that I mean only the majority of boys and girls. Some, of course, do not see the thing so clearly, do not quite understand what is driving them against the laws of Christianity, but many of them do. Hence, they hate anything Christly. How, then, could they be taught to live according to the Christian formula of morality? The old ideas of right and wrong don't influence them, because they no longer believe in them. And this explains their attitude. The attitude that what they are doing is perfectly right. They are not moral, but, in the Christian sense, unmoral. Under such conditions, what can discipline do? You can't discipline a person's deeper nature, force him to accept something he cannot see. I'm going to cite another case to illustrate this point. A minister whose code was strictly puritanic brought up his son under the most rigid discipline imaginable. The boy was forced not only to attend church regularly, but also to listen to his father's sermons at home. It was drilled into him day after day that smoking, drinking, and sex were evil, and that he would be punished by God if he succumbed to sinful temptation. At the age of 18, the boy came home drunk. The father almost murdered him, then gave him another one of his sermons, and locked him in his room to meditate on it. For a while it seemed that the son had learned his lesson, but in a year's time he broke loose altogether, and he is still leading a licentious life. Of course his father threw him out, but he has earned his way and is quite independent. Recently his mother tried to effect a reconciliation. The father said his son could return home if he promised to be good. The boy refused, saying that he was good enough, and sick of all these Christian-y notions. But I have got somewhat ahead of myself. To look back over several years again, we see how the first seeds of revolt were planted, and how it was impossible for discipline or anything else to stifle their growth. The old world was dying, the world based on Christianity. Something new must rise, and the younger generation embodies this new spirit. The climax, I should say, came with the Great War. This served completely to shatter all the old traditions, to tear down standards, and leave only the ruins upon which to build a new life. It was the final triumph of materialism, of reality over idealism. And when that mentions the Great War, that is World War I. In short, the time for the new was on hand, and so, while the older generation was still shocked, trying to pull itself together, the younger generation broke into its revolt. It started in Europe, because Europe had been the most completely shattered. Boys and girls threw off all restraint, flouted their parents, and commenced their feverish pursuit of physical amusement. Perhaps they scarcely knew what they wanted, but they were aware that their time had come. They must break loose, assert themselves, gain their freedom. America was ripe for such a revolt. Indeed, the very spirit of America was that of a youth. We were a young country, and all the speed and efficiency of a machine age in full blossom cried to young pulse and vigor. But it required something of our native shores to touch off that flare. And what could be a more fitting torch than Prohibition? The last stand of the Christians, the last effort to make Christian morality prevail. With Prohibition came the revolt of America's youth. Boys and girls began to drink extensively, defying the law. Nightlife blossomed out with all its frenzy of jazz and sex, and the movement spread. What of the older people? Strangely enough, Prohibition proved too much for the majority of them. Thus, for the first time, some of them began to break the old traditions too. As soon as they went this far, a more complete surrender was inevitable. By breaking their own traditions, they had practically acknowledged that the new spirit was the stronger. Many of them followed the very path which youth had chosen. If they succumbed to age, they would have to remain in the background. So they literally tried to become young again. Women bobbed their hair, powdered and rouged their faces, shortened their skirts. Men dressed in loud clothes, took up with young flappers, and learned the latest dances. Sometimes, of course, this change on the part of the older folks took a higher form. That is to say, he could be a mental rather than physical change. They reversed their opinions, discarded their old pet dogmas, and opened their minds to the modern trend of thought and culture. As far as the rest of the older generation, the back numbers, they are still clinging to the corpse of Christianity, busily applying the pull motor to it in a vain effort to keep alive the odd doctrines of Puritanic belief. They can't understand how America has become so corrupt, how such widespread immorality can be prevalent. And so we find ourselves in the present age. I have tried to show, as completely as my limited space permits, the reasons for the new attitude of the younger generation, and will now take up the conditions to which this attitude has given rise. And that is the end of chapter 2. And we will stop there, and I will see you in part 3. Thank you for listening.